In November 2023, an ordinary forestry surveyor performed a routine task in the Bavarian Alps. The freezing morning air was utterly still, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of his boots against the dense, frost-hardened snow. He stopped. A jagged edge of rusted steel protruded from a recently collapsed embankment, entirely out of place among the ancient pines. When he cleared the freezing mud with his gloved hands, his breath caught in his throat. It was not discarded scrap, but a heavy blast door, its sealing mechanism still locked tight. When a specialized archaeological team arrived weeks later, equipped with ground-penetrating radar and heavy excavation machinery, they uncovered an expansive, multi-room subterranean command bunker hidden beneath 60 feet of bedrock. Inside lies the lost operational ledger of Luftwaffe dated February 1944, and a locked iron strongbox that suggests the absolute collapse of the German airspace was not entirely what history recorded. Major Wilhelm Brandt was a veteran flight instructor who supposedly perished during a routine transfer flight in the final months of the war. According to official records, he and his entire squadron were lost over the dark, freezing waters of the Baltic Sea, leaving no trace behind. But the rusted strongbox tells a different story. If you want to see how this story unfolds, hit the like button. Why did one of the Luftwaffe's most capable surviving instructors disappear with a mountain of highly classified documents right when his country needed him the most? The morning of February 20, 1944, began with a heavy, oppressive silence inside the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin. Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, stood staring at the massive situation map, the blue smoke from his trademark cigar hanging stagnant in the cold room. The numbers staring back at him were heavier than any bomb the Allies could drop. Outside, the civilian population of Berlin moved through the bombed-out streets as usual, completely unaware of the invisible, catastrophic math unfolding above their heads. But inside the high command, a quiet, terrifying crisis was taking root. More than 1,000 German fighter pilots had already been lost in an alarmingly short span of time. These were not just fresh recruits. Many of them were irreplaceable veterans, squadron leaders, and seasoned tacticians who had survived years of brutal combat. However, the true nightmare was not simply the loss of life, but the complete and total collapse of the training pipeline required to replace them. Enter Major Wilhelm Brandt. At 34 years old, Brandt was a hardened veteran of the Battle of Britain, a pragmatist who had long ago shed the romanticized illusions of aerial chivalry. He was not a heroic ace seeking glory in the daily newspaper dispatches. He was a methodical, exhausted survivor. His reputation was built on his cold, analytical approach to survival, a trait that had ultimately landed him the critical role of overseeing the advanced fighter training schools. But the historical situation had rapidly devolved beyond the scope of mere training. The Allied forces had launched Operation Argument, later known simply as Big Week. Thousands of heavy American bombers, escorted by lethal, long-range P-51 Mustangs, were systematically dismantling the German aviation industry. The skies over Europe had become a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. The military collapse was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing bleed. The Luftwaffe still had aircraft rolling off the dispersed assembly lines, but the men required to fly them were disappearing faster than they could be printed on the daily casualty manifests. Germany's worst month was not characterized by a lack of courage, but by mathematics taking over the battlefield. New pilots were being rushed into the freezing skies with barely 100 flight hours to their names. They were sent directly against highly Experienced American airmen who routinely boasted over 400 hours of rigorous training and combat experience. The outcome was violently predictable. However, amidst the chaos of this operational slaughter, strange anomalies began to appear in the dispatch logs. Foreshadowing began to creep into the daily operations of Brandt's training wing. Supply requisitions for aviation fuel were suddenly being diverted away from the active defense squadrons and quietly funneled to remote, secondary airfields in the southern mountains. Veteran instructors, men who were desperately needed to lead the terrified new recruits into the bomber streams, were inexplicably vanishing from the duty rosters. They were not marked as casualties, nor were they officially transferred. They simply ceased to exist on paper. Furthermore, Brandt's personal flight logs from mid-February showed a series of late-night meetings with high-ranking officials from the Armaments Ministry, a severe breach of standard. Chain of command protocols. Hints of secret orders began to circulate among the exhausted ground crews. Whispers echoed in the freezing hangars about a shadow directive, a mission that superseded the defense of the capital itself. Mechanics reported seeing heavily modified transport aircraft being loaded with wooden crates rather than ammunition. Brandt himself grew increasingly distant, spending his nights meticulously burning routine correspondence while obsessively guarding a single leather-bound satchel. The air war had turned irreversible, and it seemed that certain individuals within the high command had already accepted the inevitable. They were no longer fighting to win the war. They were fighting to preserve something else entirely. What they didn't know was that this hidden agenda would ultimately cost the lives of hundreds of innocent young men. The night of February 24, 1944, offered zero visibility, a blessing and a curse for what was about to unfold. Major Brandt stood on the freezing tarmac of a secondary airfield near Leipzig, the bitter winter wind biting through his heavy leather flight jacket. The official destination logged for his ad hoc squadron of 12 aircraft was a routine defensive patrol over the industrial Ruhr Valley. However, the secret route mapped out in the cramped cockpit of his command plane pointed directly south, toward the jagged peaks of the Bavarian Alps. He was leading a mixed formation, 4 heavily loaded Junkers Ju-52 transport planes and an escort of 8 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. But these were no ordinary fighters. They were piloted by the last remaining cadre of elite instructors, carrying not ammunition, but the highly classified technical manuals, training syllabuses, and the blueprints for the next generation of jet fighters. The departure was a masterclass in tension. The heavy Junkers lumbered down the runway, their engines roaring against the dark, struggling to achieve lift under the immense weight of their secret cargo. Brandt pulled his canopy shut, sealing himself in the cramped, smells-like aviation fuel and sweat confines of his cockpit. Almost immediately, the obstacles began to mount. The weather front they were forced to fly into was vicious. At 8,000 feet, ice began to form rapidly on the leading edges of the wings, severely degrading their aerodynamic lift. The temperature inside the unheated cockpits plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. Brandt's fingers went numb on the control stick, every minor adjustment requiring immense physical effort. But the weather was not their only enemy. 70 miles into their journey, the static crackle of the radio brought terrifying news. A roving pack of British de Havilland Mosquito night fighters had been entirely misidentified by the ground radar and was sweeping through their sector. The hardship rapidly escalated from a minor logistical problem into a full-blown crisis. Brandt had to make a hard, agonizing decision. If they broke radio silence to coordinate a defense, the Allied signals intelligence would instantly pinpoint their location, bringing down the wrath of the entire night fighter network. If they stayed silent, they risked being picked off one by one in the dark. The fuel gauges across the squadron were already dropping toward 40%, a terrifying reality in the freezing night sky. The critical turning point occurred precisely at 2:15 hours. The sharp, terrifying flash of tracer fire illuminated the darkness just 200 yards off Brandt's starboard wing. One of the Junker's transports had been spotted. The heavy aircraft shuddered as armor-piercing rounds tore through its fuselage. However, instead of ordering his veteran escorts to engage and protect the transport, Brandt issued a chilling, prearranged code word. The 8 Messerschmitts immediately dropped into a steep, violent dive, abandoning the crippled transport to the darkness. It was a calculated, brutal sacrifice. The transport and its crew were bait, intentionally left to draw the British fighters away from the remaining 3 transports that held the most critical documents. Brandt watched the fiery explosion bloom in his rearview mirror, a heavy knot of guilt forming in his stomach that would never leave him. The near disaster forced the remaining formation down to a terrifyingly low altitude. They flew at barely 500 feet, navigating entirely by the faint, moonlit reflections of the rivers and rail lines. The sound of their engines echoed violently off the rolling hills, a constant, deafening roar that vibrated deep within their bones. Every shadow looked like an enemy fighter. Every bump of turbulence felt like a fatal structural failure. The fuel gauges continued their merciless descent. 30%, 20%, 10%. Finally, after 3 agonizing hours of flight, the jagged silhouettes of the Alps broke the horizon. The arrival was anything but triumphant. The hidden airfield was little more than a cleared strip of frozen grass surrounded by dense pine forests. There were no landing lights, only a series of faint, flickering kerosene lanterns held by the waiting ground crew. Brandt brought his exhausted fighter down hard, the landing gear slamming brutally into the frozen earth. As the remaining transports rolled to a halt, the immediate outcome was a profound, unsettling silence. They had survived the journey, but the cost had been immense. They had delivered the documents, but they had abandoned their comrades to the freezing dark. When the war finally ground to a halt in May 1945, the Allied intelligence apparatus immediately began sweeping through the ashes of the defeated nation. Operation Paperclip was in full swing, and interrogations were brutal, methodical, and relentless. American and British investigators were desperately searching for missing technical data, specific jet engine blueprints, and the unaccounted-for training rosters of the Luftwaffe's elite schools. Major Wilhelm Brandt, now operating under the slightly altered name of Wilhelm Becker, found himself sitting in a stark, blindingly bright interrogation room in Frankfurt. The men sitting across from him were not ordinary soldiers. They were highly specialized intelligence officers who knew exactly what they were looking for. They asked precise, dangerous questions about the missing flight logs from February 1944. They demanded to know the exact whereabouts of the 12 missing aircraft and the veteran instructors who seemingly vanished into thin air. Brandt played his part flawlessly. He adopted the persona of a broken, disillusioned mid-level officer who knew nothing beyond the scope of his immediate orders. He claimed his unit was entirely decimated during the chaotic retreats of 1945, their records burned by overzealous local commanders to prevent capture. However, Major Thomas Davies, a brilliant British intelligence analyst, remained deeply suspicious. Davies had cross-referenced the surviving fuel requisition forms with the known casualty lists, and the mathematics simply did not align. There was a massive, glaring gap in the data. Davies knew that 1,000 pilots didn't just die without a corresponding paper trail. and he knew that an entire cadre of elite instructors couldn't simply evaporate. But the facade of a normal post-war life is a powerful shield. Brandt was released due to a lack of concrete evidence. He quietly relocated to a modest apartment in Munich, securing a quiet, unremarkable job as a mechanical engineer for the local municipal tram company. He wore simple gray suits, rode the streetcar to work every morning, and blended seamlessly into the broken, rebuilding society around him. He married, had a daughter, and spent his weekends quietly tending to a small garden. To his neighbors, he was just another quiet man carrying the invisible scars of a devastating war. Yet the investigators who remained suspicious never entirely closed the file. Major Davies, even after returning to civilian life in London, continued to quietly pull threads. He noticed the agonizing evidence gaps, missing pages in the surviving Reich Air Ministry archives, altered service records that seemed hastily retyped, and glaring inconsistencies in the testimonies of the surviving ground crews from Leipzig. But every time Davies thought he had a solid lead, the trail would instantly run cold. Witnesses would suddenly change their stories, or crucial documents would be conveniently misplaced in the vast, chaotic archives of the newly divided Germany. The time-passing montage of the next few decades was a frustrating exercise in futility. The 1950s bled into the 1960s. The sharp, terrifying memories of the war began to fade into the dull ache of history. Brandt continued his quiet, monotonous routine, never speaking of his past, never reaching out to his former comrades. He watched the world move on, carrying the immense, crushing weight of his secret in total silence. Davies eventually passed away in 1982, his office still cluttered with unresolved files and faded photographs of missing aircraft. When Brandt himself finally died of natural causes in his sleep in 1994, his family mourned a quiet, loving father. There were no military honors, no mentions of his past life in the local obituaries. He was buried in a simple grave under a weeping willow. The secret died with him. Or so they thought. The modern excavation began under a shroud of extreme academic secrecy. When the Bavarian forestry surveyor stumbled upon the rusted blast door in November 2023, local authorities immediately recognized the potential danger of unexploded ordnance. However, when the specialized team from the German Archaeological Institute arrived, equipped with state-of-the-art LiDAR scanners and ground-penetrating radar, the digital models revealed something vastly more complex than a simple ammunition dump. The technology mapped out a deeply reinforced, multi-chambered subterranean complex, heavily shielded by lead and reinforced concrete. It took 3 grueling weeks of drilling through the frozen bedrock just to bypass the primary locking mechanism of the heavy steel door. As the heavy door finally groaned open, the stale, oxygen-deprived air rushed out, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of aged paper, machine oil, and damp concrete. The progressive discoveries began almost immediately. Chamber 1 was surprisingly mundane, yet deeply unsettling. It was a perfectly preserved armory and quartermaster's store. Rusted sidearms remained locked in their racks, while dozens of pristine, fur-lined flight jackets hung perfectly still on wooden hangers, seemingly waiting for pilots who never arrived. The forensic analysis of the dust patterns indicated that this room had not been accessed since the day the door was sealed in early 1944. It was a ghost town frozen in absolute temporal stasis. However, moving deeper into the complex, the team breached Chamber 2, and the tone of the excavation drastically shifted. This room was a dedicated archival space, lined floor to ceiling with heavy steel filing cabinets. Inside were the missing casualty reports from February 1944. Here were the true, unredacted records of the 1,000 dead pilots. The expert analysis of these documents was heartbreaking. Cryptographic teams decoded the shorthand margins, revealing the exact names, ages, and incredibly sparse flight hours of the young men who were fed into the meat grinder. The records explicitly detailed how recruits with less than 80 hours of flight time were routinely marked as fully operational to satisfy the impossible quotas demanded by the high command. But Chamber 3 held a significantly darker piece of the puzzle. This room contained the missing training syllabuses and operational directives. Architectural experts noted that this room was specifically designed to be rapidly incinerated. Thermite charges were still wired to the filing cabinets, though the detonators had long since degraded. The documents here proved that the massive losses were not an accident of war, but a calculated, deliberate sacrifice. The papers detailed explicit orders to drastically reduce training times, knowingly sending inadequate pilots to their deaths simply to deplete American ammunition and fuel, buying precious time for the development of the secret jet fighter programs. The investigators stood in stunned silence as the sheer, callous mathematics of the strategy became undeniable. The tension reached its absolute peak as the team approached the deepest section of the bunker. Ground-penetrating radar had indicated a final, heavily shielded vault buried beneath the floor of the third chamber. It took another 4 days to cut through the reinforced steel plate. The final container was not a massive archive, but a surprisingly small, lead-lined strongbox. Resting on a simple wooden desk, the team expected to find the ultimate technical blueprints, or perhaps the stolen gold reserves rumored to be hidden by fleeing officials. But container number 4 held something that changed everything. Inside the strongbox were the personal operational logs of Major Wilhelm Brandt, alongside a set of highly classified, direct orders signed by the high command. The revelation was not just about the sacrifice of the recruits, it was about the survival of the elite. The orders explicitly instructed Brandt to systematically pull the best, most experienced instructors off the front lines during the most desperate hours of the defense. While the green recruits were sent to die in the hundreds, the veterans were secretly hidden away in this very bunker. They were ordered to preserve themselves, to draft the new manuals for the jet age, and to completely abandon the active defense of their own airspace. Brandt hadn't just hidden documents, he had hidden the evidence that the Luftwaffe leadership had intentionally cannibalized its own future to save a select few. The 1,000 dead pilots were not just casualties of a superior enemy. They were the victims of a brutal, calculated betrayal by their own commanders. The historical significance of this subterranean discovery cannot be overstated. For over 7 decades, the established narrative surrounding Germany's catastrophic losses in February 1944 focused primarily on the overwhelming industrial might and tactical superiority of the Allied air forces. Historians universally agreed that the Luftwaffe was simply ground down by attrition. However, the documents retrieved from the Bavarian bunker fundamentally reshaped what we thought we knew about the final years of the air war. It shifted the blame from purely external factors to a deeply internal, systemic betrayal. The truth revealed in Brandt's hidden vault explicitly connects the dots that had baffled scholars for generations. It explains exactly why the German aviation industry continued to produce thousands of capable fighter aircraft late into the war, yet the skies remained heavily dominated by the Allies. The planes were there, but the men capable of flying them had been either intentionally sacrificed or deliberately hidden away. The mathematics of the air war were no longer just about production numbers. They were about a horrific triage implemented by a desperate command structure. They had traded the lives of 1,000 young boys for the theoretical promise of a jet-powered future that would never truly materialize. This revelation served as a profound, albeit posthumous, vindication of dismissed investigators like Major Thomas Davies. For years, Davies was marginalized within the intelligence community, his theories regarding a lost cadre of instructors dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of a man who couldn't let the war go. The academic establishment had long rejected the idea of a massive, coordinated internal cover-up, attributing the missing records to the chaotic bombings of Berlin. But the meticulously preserved files in the bunker proved that Davies was absolutely correct. The numbers hadn't added up because the books were deliberately, systematically cooked. Furthermore, the discovery cracked open a wider, heavily obscured escape network. The orders found in the final vault referenced several other preservation sites scattered across southern Germany and Austria. It became clear that Brandt's flight was not an isolated incident, but part of a much broader, highly organized directive to save the elite technical and instructional minds of the regime, while the frontline soldiers were left to be annihilated. Related cases of missing aircraft and mysteriously vanishing officers, long considered entirely separate mysteries, were suddenly linked by a single, terrifying thread of institutional self-preservation. The truth was finally out in the light, but it was far darker and more cynical than anyone had ever anticipated. Amidst the cold, calculated mathematics of the military records, the excavation team discovered something profoundly human in the corner of the final vault. Tucked beneath the heavy operational logs was a small, worn leather journal belonging to Major Brandt, alongside a bundle of unsent letters tied with a frayed piece of twine. These personal objects stripped away the rigid facade of the military officer and revealed the agonizing guilt of a man forced to betray his own conscience. The letters were addressed to the mothers and fathers of the green recruits he had knowingly sent into the bomber streams to die. "I am ordered to tell you they died for the homeland," one heavily stained letter read. "But the truth is they died to buy us time we did not deserve. I hold their blood on my hands, and the cold of this mountain cannot freeze the shame in my heart." Brandt's final years in Munich suddenly took on a tragic, haunting context. The quiet engineer who rode the streetcar to work was not a man who had successfully escaped his past. He was a man who was entirely imprisoned by it. He lived every day knowing that his survival was paid for by the slaughter of 1,000 young men. When the archaeological findings were finally made public, the reactions from his surviving descendants were incredibly complex. His elderly daughter, who had only ever known him as a gentle, quiet gardener, wept openly during a press conference in Berlin. "We grew up thinking he was just a quiet man who survived a terrible time," she stated, her hands trembling as she held a replica of the journal. "We never knew he was carrying the ghosts of 1,000 boys. I am angry that he lied to us, but I am heartbroken that he had to carry this alone." The discovery did not bring glory, but a deep, agonizing sorrow. It humanized a man who had made an impossible, horrific choice, leaving a legacy defined not by heroism, but by an unbearable, silent grief. History teaches us that the greatest tragedies of war are rarely found on the open battlefield, but rather hidden in the quiet, desperate decisions made in the shadows. The loss of 1,000 pilots in February 1944 was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a deliberate, mathematical sacrifice that shattered the soul of an entire generation. In the end, the true cost of the conflict was measured not just in destroyed machinery, but in the deliberate destruction of trust between the commanders and the commanded. Today, the freezing mountain air over the Bavarian Alps remains utterly still, the ancient pines standing as silent sentinels over a landscape that once hid the darkest secrets of a fallen empire. The rusted blast door has been carefully removed, and the deeply buried documents now reside in the sterile, climate-controlled archives of the Federal Military Museum, a permanent testament to the horrific cost of institutional survival. The ghosts of the 1,000 lost boys have finally been given their truth. Comment which mystery we should investigate next. The past is never entirely buried.